Pardee School Dean, Professor Scott Taylor, dear colleagues, esteemed BU students, good afternoon, and welcome to the 2024 Anthony Janetos Memorial Lecture, the annual Distinguished Lecture of the Pardee Center for the Study of the Longer Range Future. My name is Jorge Heine, and I'm the Interim Director of the Pardee Center. Established in 2000, thanks to the generous philanthropy of BU alumnus Frederick Pardee, and preceding the establishment of the Pardee School, the Pardee Center aims to look ahead and try to discern which way the world is going, by no means an easy task in these troubled times. We do this in a variety of ways, supporting the research of BU faculty as well as of doctoral students through our Summer Research Fellows Program and through symposia, panel discussions, and publications of various kinds. But perhaps the flagship activity of the center is its annual Distinguished Lecture, now named after one of its directors, Professor Anthony Janetos, who was its head from 2013 to 2019, and did so much to position the center on the issue of the challenges of climate change in the global debate. Over the years, the lecture has been given by some of the world's leading minds, including economists like Amartya Sen, a Nobel Prize winner, physicist Freeman Dyson, and in the more recent past, last year, in fact, by one of Asia's leading public intellectuals, Ambassador Kishore Mahbubani from the National University of Singapore. Some of you in this room had the chance to attend to it, and it had the provocative title of, "Is the Asian Century Really Coming?" He started by saying, the answer is yes, but I guess I'll have to elaborate a little bit, which he did. It is thus a very special privilege for the Pardee Center to host none other than President Ernesto Zedillo, a former president of Mexico and currently the Frederick Eisman Director of the Center for the Study of Globalization at Yale University, where he is also a professor in international economics and politics and a professor in international and area studies. Now, if I were to read his full CV, I would be here for several hours, and I certainly wouldn't want to impose that on you. So let me cut to the chase, and let me put it this way. President Zedillo belongs to the very rare category of scholar-statesmen that we have had in Latin America in the course of the past few decades. Eminent scholars with a very distinguished record in academia, but that also feel drawn to public service and are able to exercise their leadership at the highest levels. They thus bring to bear to politics, to national decision-making, to very complex policy issues, their extraordinary analytical abilities, and thus are able to leave the world a better place as a result of what they do. I would put in that category President Fernando Henrique Cardoso of Brazil, President Ricardo Lagos of Chile, President Leonel Fernandez of Dominican Republic, and of course, President Ernesto Zedillo of Mexico. And let me just say that the challenges President Zedillo faced in office in the 6 years he spent in the former presidential palace, Los Pinos, were not for the faint-hearted. A few days after his inauguration, he had to face a tremendous economic crisis that threatened not just to bring down the Mexican peso, but the whole edifice of the Mexican economy. On top of that, he had a guerrilla uprising in Chiapas in southern Mexico. Now, how is that for starters? And in the 6 years he spent in office, he managed to stabilize the country, to bring the measure of progress that the country needed. And believe it or not, despite these tremendous problems, despite these tremendous challenges, on leaving office, his standing in public opinion polls was at 64%, something most leaders in the world would only dream of. So, ever since joining his alma mater, Yale University, where he had done a PhD in economics. In his current position as head of the Center for the Study of Globalization, he has become one of the world's leading voices on the subject, serving on a number of prestigious international commissions that have looked at the way transborder flows of goods, services, capital, people, and cultural products are affecting the world. He holds decorations from the governments of 32 countries, as well as honorary doctorates from a number of universities, including Harvard, Yale, and the University of Ghana. I was privileged to meet President Zedillo in Canada some years ago at the Center for International Governance Innovation, CIGI, with which I was affiliated at the time, on the occasion of a remarkable policy dialogue on the future of global governance that President Zedillo held with former Canadian Prime Minister Paul Martin. And I am delighted that President Zedillo accepted our invitation to join us today. But let me turn to the substance of today's lecture. Over the past 40 years, the current phase of globalization that started basically around 1980 with the coming on the market of the personal PC. Believe it or not, when I was doing my doctoral studies at Stanford University, I wrote my papers on a typewriter. So that gives you an idea of how the world has changed. CNN came on the market as well, and a new era started in IT, in telecom, bringing us things like the internet and many others. I would argue, and I realize this is a controversial subject, I would argue that globalization has been very beneficial for the world. 1 billion people have been lifted from poverty. Interestingly, in fact, developing countries in some ways have perhaps benefited more than developed countries, and the way people have been lifted from poverty all across Africa, Asia, and Latin America in these 40 years has been quite remarkable. Now, having said that, globalization is in trouble, and so is the world. Globalization is slowing down, and so is the world economy. The latest report from the World Bank and from the IMF say that medium-term projections of growth for the world economy are the lowest in decades, partly because of the slowing down of globalization and because of trade fragmentations. Tariffs are back with a vengeance, and they are more and more popular. And as a result of that, well, the economies slow down. It's not very surprising. Ian Bremmer, the founder of the Eurasia Group, recently said that, and I quote, "The problem of the past 50 years was not globalization, it was globalism. It was decisions being made by a small number of beneficiaries that were very powerful that said, we are not going to pay attention to the fact that the social contract is eroding." Is that so? At the Pardee Center, we like to ask big questions. So the question we put to President Zedillo is this: is globalization over? If so, who is to blame? President Zedillo, over to you.
Let me close your speech, because I will be tempted to read it. I don't want me to happen what happened to President Menem of Argentina. You know, he was in this meeting with a private sector group, and he went to the podium and started to read a speech. And after 5 minutes, he realized that that was not his speech, but the previous speaker's speech. And he realized, and he looks around, and he was very quick, at least to make a joke, said, well, you know, what happens is that I like this speech so much that I decided to repeat it for you. I don't want to do that this afternoon. But in any case, Professor Dean, I'm talking to you. It's great to be here. Dear faculty members, dear students, dear members of this great community. I am really happy to be this beautiful afternoon here at Boston University. I thank you, Ambassador Heine, for the invitation and also for suggesting the very provocative title of my talk this afternoon. And I said it is provocative because although it has an obvious answer, your question, is globalization over? I would say obviously no, not yet, but it gives rise to a number of other fundamental and profound questions about the state of the geopolitics, the geoeconomics, and the global governance of the world. If we start with that question. But let me start with the question. And as I said, the answer is no, globalization is not over. But as you mentioned, it has slowed down. The growth of globalization has slowed down, particularly since the great financial crisis of 2008, 2009. But I think it's important to look from a long-term perspective about the phenomenon. And of course, here I am mostly speaking about economic globalization, although globalization has other dimensions. This afternoon, I think it is convenient to speak essentially about economic globalization. And what we today call globalization or modern globalization, contemporary globalization, really dates back to the end of the Second World War. The world had gone through a very difficult first half. Difficult is an understatement because we had, humanity had two major world wars, the first and the second. The international system was completely destroyed, but more fundamentally, the loss of human lives, the violence, the destruction was really unprecedented. So at the end of the Second World War, under the leadership, we must emphasize this for reasons that will become evident, under the leadership of the United States, the foundations of a new international system was put in place. And part of that system had to do with commerce, with trade, a multilateral trading system, gradually, progressively was built over many decades. And along with other decisions that were taken at the time, the so-called Bretton Woods system, significantly, the international economy started to grow again. Commerce started to grow among countries that not too many years before had been in total war. The reconstruction of Europe was very important, and as part of that reconstruction, trade among the European countries restarted, and very significantly, trade between Europe and the United States started to grow also rather quickly. Then other countries came on board to the system, but also to trade and international investment. And all of this had as a consequence that ever since trade was growing even faster than the world economy. And this is not insignificant because actually in the 1950s and 60s, of course, coming from a very low point, many economies grew very fast. Countries that used to be considered kind of developed became again developed, but not only that, but some countries in Asia started to be active participants also in the international economy. So economists like to distinguish, this first period of globalization up to the early 1990s, right after the collapse of the wall and the collapse of the Soviet Union, when international trade, as they call it technically, had an income elasticity greater than one, that is to say, grew more than GDP, but less than 1.5, right? It was very significant, but still not spectacularly as it will happen later. In the 1990s and up to 2008, that elasticity became greater than 2, and there were many factors involved in that pattern. People speak, of course, very significantly, with good reason, about the insertion of China into the international flows of trade and investment very dynamically, along with the spectacular growth that the Chinese economy started to experience around that time. But that was not the only factor. There was also the fact that the Eastern and Central European countries that had been part of the Soviet Union started to integrate very quickly into the global economy, into the Western world, and they also were important contributors to the growth of international trade. Also, a number of emerging economies, emerging or developing economies, had by then started to abandon their old import substitution strategies and became more open to trade and started to be more significant exporters, and therefore they also became part of that story of accelerating globalization. Also at the same time, and this has to do with something that was mentioned by Ambassador Hein, technology facilitated trade in fashions that were really unprecedented. Economists like to speak, following economist Richard Baldwin, of the second unbundling. If the first golden age of globalization in the 19th century was about separating production from consumption, thanks to the Industrial Revolution and the revolution in transportation, the second unbundling was about separating the process of production, partition the process of production from, let's say, design to final delivery into many tasks or parts of that global supply chain. And that explains also why the gross figures of international trade accelerated dramatically in the 1990s and the early years of 2000, because before, production was about producing with economies of scale, with integration, and basically the whole process localized in a specific geographic place. Now, because of technology that allow the coordination of complexity, thanks to these IT technologies, it was possible to separate the processes of production, and this was part of the great opportunity that was provided to many emerging economies. Because before, in order to become significant in terms of industrialization, you needed to have great investments in infrastructure, great economies of scale, and now with the new technologies, it was sufficient to exploit not the comparative advantage of a whole production process, but really the comparative advantage of being the producer of one of the tasks, one of the services, of one of the components that were part of the global supply chain. And overnight, you could be then a player in the global economy. And that's exactly what some Asian countries, significantly China, learned to do very quickly. And that also explained the, let's say, explosion of globalization around those years. Some economists called that process that started around 1990, 1991, the period of hyper globalization. I'm not so sure, I think it's hyperbolic to call it hyper-globalization, because by any significant, careful measure, of integration of markets, we were never yet there again. The integration of markets still leaves a lot of space to pursue further interdependence, and this is not so hard to measure. You know, economic historians, like some in the neighborhood, like Professors Williamson or O'Rourke, well, have concluded that the first globalization of the 19th century started in the second decade of the century. How did they do that? Because they first measured whether wages were approaching in one country to another among trading partners. They measured how prices, whether were converging or not, because of trade. And by doing that careful analysis, they concluded that if we are going to speak about the start of globalization, well, we cannot really speak about Christopher Columbus or the great travelers, but really we have to go back not too far in the past, actually the second decade of the 19th century, when we really start to see integration of markets as measured by the convergence of prices. Well, if we do the same exercise today, as I think Professor Lawrence of Harvard has done, the hyper prefix doesn't really apply. There is still a long way to go before we can use really hyper-globalization. But in any case, some people like to use it, and I respect that, although I disagree. But in any case, things some will propose change significantly with the great financial crisis. Statistically, it is easy to see that trade started to slow down, growth of trade started to slow down around the great financial crisis, although some friends of mine who have done work more carefully actually purport that this slowing down started before the great financial crisis. And the explanation they give is very simple. So you cannot expect China to continue growing at the incredible rates of 15% that they were doing around, let's say, 2002, and therefore trading as much as they did before. You could not expect this process of reintegration of the Central and Eastern European countries, integration into the global economy, to continue making the same contribution that they did in the 1990s. The global supply chain phenomenon also had to acquire at some point stability, and actually they opine that the slowing down of globalization had started even before the global financial crisis. But in any case, it is a fact that if there was this incredible acceleration by which trade was, exports plus imports, was around 25% of global GDP in 1960, it reached, during this period that they call hyperglobalization, around 60% of global GDP, and has stayed more or less around the same level. Immediately, this tells us that if this has stayed around that level, well, that globalization is not over, is there, and basically with the size that it had some years ago, but of course its growth has slowed down. And here I'm talking about trade in merchandise and also in services. Interestingly, the growth in trade in goods, physical goods, has slowed down, while trade in services has been increasing very significantly at a much higher rate than trade in goods. So what we see overall, that this rate of 60% trade GDP ratio has stabilized, is basically explained by the fact that services are growing significantly year after year. And I think this is important because services are an engine of growth in most economies in the world. Well, there are other facets of globalization. Of course, there is financial globalization, and definitely with what happened during the great financial crisis of 08, 09, financial globalization has slowed down. And I am happy about it. I have always been, a little bit skeptical of the benefits of financial globalization, particularly when it reaches some reasonable limits. For one thing, I happen to believe from experience that countries should rely primarily on their own domestic savings to pay for investments that in turn fuel economic growth. When they rely too much on foreign savings, usually that's a call for trouble. When you see a country with current account deficits that somehow must be financed in the vicinity of 6-7% of their respective GDPs, well, I do get significantly nervous. And I do get significantly nervous because it has happened in my country, and it has happened in many countries, not least the United States. Before the great financial crisis, when the United States was running a current account deficit of 6-7% of GDP, some economies were giving very charitable explanations of that substantial current account deficit. None other than Ben Bernanke, who later will become a hero as chairman of the Federal Reserve, at the time was very relaxed about it. Say, oh, this is part of the global savings glut, so don't worry. So happens that the US as a destination of investment is very attractive, and that's why all these savings are coming into this economy. Other people, including myself, were saying, well, these macroeconomic imbalances always bring trouble. And they did. Indeed, they did. When you have too much money chasing too few investment opportunities, that's a call for trouble. And that's exactly what happened here in the United States and what has happened in many other countries in history, including my own country. But in any case, financial globalization has slowed down. And then there is, of course, the other dimension of it, which is international migration of people. And of course, this is very much in the news in some countries, certainly the United States, but also in Europe and in other parts of the world. Interestingly, from a long-run, long-term perspective, it happens to be let's say, a less dynamic phenomenon. The ratio of international migrants to the global population has been practically stable for about half a century, for many reasons, but it's not something like trade or even financial flows in the world. But of course, the politics of migration have become increasingly complex, despite the fact that relative to the size of the economy, relative to global population, it's not really that something extraordinary has happened in recent years, and yet it is very much in the political agenda. So the first conclusion is, well, globalization is alive, less dynamic growth than in the past. Possibly the explanation of that slowdown is a cyclical explanation, but there might be some structural reasons why that dynamism has slowed down, and some of those structural reasons may be a cause for serious concern. Professor Heine already mentioned protectionism. And he did it in a very, ambassadors are very careful when they describe phenomena. They want to be truthful, but they don't want to go into details because they probably step into somebody's food. Well, I'm not a diplomat. I'm so sorry. I never made it to that point, dear ambassador. And I think things must be said the way they are. And in the same way that the US was the leader and the builder of the international system that was created after the Second World War, and that in many ways has delivered not only the prosperity, but also whatever international peace we have had, which I think relative to the terrible first half of the 20th century, the situation has been much better. I am sorry to tell you that the United States seems now obsessed, the government, and I think people are not really aware or mindful of that the US has led the charge against the international system and international trade. Why do I say that? Well, this is not just a saying. Unfortunately, the evidence is very clear. It's not only that the United States was quite restrained in the early years of the century to push, for example, for the conclusion of the WTO Doha round that started in November of 2001, again under the leadership of the United States, but afterwards the United States became rather passive about the negotiations and the conclusion of the round. But more importantly, the trade policies in the United States have become openly protectionist and more worrisome against the rules-based system that had prevailed over many decades. And there are landmark moments of this dramatic shift. Obviously, the most significant moment have to do with the decisions taken in the previous US administration. Imagine the US skillfully, I would say in a very too pushy way, negotiates the TPP. And if you like to get bored with reading trade agreements, you will conclude that never in its history the United States have got a trade agreement in which basically everything that the United States wanted was obtained in a negotiation. If you are careful enough to compare trade agreements, you say, wow, how did they do it? Because it was not only about trade liberalization, which was substantial, including agriculture, including rice in Japan, which rice in Japan has been almost a religious topic. Don't touch it, and it was touched by TPP. It was about disciplines on intellectual property rights. It was disciplines about labor standards. It was about disciplines in government procurement. It was about disciplines in state-owned enterprises. It was even about disciplines in exchange rate management. So everything that the US wanted was in that document. A negotiation that started with President George W. Bush and that was concluded with President Obama. And in the second year of the Trump administration, I don't know whether somebody wrote a briefing of half a page for President Trump. I said, and that was already approved by the Senate. So this is terrible, the worst trade deal in the US history. Actually, he used that term for several things. So obviously that was a shock. I said, well, is this signaling the withdrawal of the United States? Well, unfortunately, that was the case because not long after that, the administration said, oh, NAFTA has been terrible for the US, has implied the closing of thousands of businesses in the US. the dismissal of thousands of workers, of millions, they use the word millions, of US workers, none of which can be documented in any way. So they call for a renegotiation of NAFTA under the threat of withdrawing from NAFTA. So the governments of Canada and Mexico, probably I would not have accepted to go into the negotiating table. At least I would have said, you know, I will do it, but you have to correct the falsehood that you expressed when you announced that you wanted NAFTA to be negotiated, because I cannot start a negotiation from a false proposition. But in any case, NAFTA was renegotiated, and I would say in terms that are not really good for any of the three participant countries, certainly not for Mexico, because this is perhaps the first trade agreement, the new trade agreement, which has a highly discriminatory treatment of one of the participants. And if you don't believe me, look at the rules of origin. There are rules of origin in the automotive industry for Canada, for the US, and some very bad ones for Mexico. And I know of no other trade deal that has that. There was also the weakening to the point of elimination of the mechanism to address disputes between states and investors. Of course, they didn't want that, said we don't want to give that protection to US investors in Canada or in Mexico. Canada said, okay, put it off the table, no longer there. In the case of Mexico, there is something remaining, but obviously that goes against the interests of Mexico, because Mexico is a less attractive place for investment, but also against the interests of people who want to invest for good reason in Mexico. And that indirectly means that US industry will be less competitive because it will be more difficult to go and gain some comparative advantage in Mexico. It was also that the US was asking practically for a sunset clause after X number of years. The agreement disappears unless the parts will ratify it again or renegotiate again. At the end, they had a mixed procedure that I think introduces a lot of uncertainty. But in any case, this was another powerful sign that the US was withdrawing. What was next? Well, what's next is to take a trade law of 1962 and also invoke the Article 21 of the GATT agreement, both of which in the national law in the US and the Article 21 invoke national security reasons to introduce protectionist actions. With the idea or the claim that countries can unilaterally use that argument to simply say I am introducing tariffs, in this case steel, aluminum, and other things, on the grounds of national security. And it's only up to me to decide whether I can do it. It is self-judging, they say, to do it or not to do it. Well, of course, the affected parties said, wait a minute, that's why we have a WTO, and that's why we have a dispute settlement understanding, and an appellate body within the dispute settlement understanding to decide whether you are right or not. The US said, no, this is self-judging, I can do it unilaterally. Well, the problem is that that is not true. And for better or for worse, at the time that this was being done, there was a case between Russia and Ukraine, where Russia interfered with trade. This is, of course, after 2014, what they did in Crimea. And the case was being studied by a panel at the WTO. And the panel said two things. One, this has to be analyzed and considered by the WTO. This is not true according to the interpretation of the law, of the trade law, of the GATT trade law. So you have to be subject to the authority of the WTO. And second, bad news for Ukraine was actually there is a national security reason, because for practical purposes there is a bellicose conflict between the two countries. But what was argued with that case was basically that the United States was not really doing something that could be done unilaterally as it was done. Well, except that, the appellate body has 7 judges, and you need 3 judges to decide finally on the cases that are brought to the WTO. And actually, even in the time of President Obama, the U.S. had been dragging its feet in the appointment of new judges. And eureka, the U.S. had the possibility, once the appointment of the 3rd judge seated in the appellate body was to conclude, simply say, I am blocking the appointment of the 3rd judge. So the practical consequence is that the most important instrument in the hands of the WTO to enforce its law is totally paralyzed. So nobody can decide if tariffs on aluminum, steel, cars, solar panels, washing machines imposed on national security reasons are legal under international law, because the appellate body is in the freezer. And the United States has not shown, nor with Trump, nor with President Biden, any willingness to rectify that decision. It is ironic because the country that has used the most the dispute settlement understanding is the United States. And the country that has won most cases is the United States. And in fact, in X number of years, all the cases brought by the United States against China, the appellate body favor the United States. So it's a rather, I call it the mystery of the US aggression on the WTO. But again, what counts is the signal. This is the system that we led in its creation, and this is the system that we seem to be engaged in destroying. And of course, the other big topic, enormous topic, is China. And of course, I start by saying that I would love to see China becoming a full democracy where human rights are truly respected, and so on and so forth, and not being what Martin Wolf calls a despotic capitalist regime, but still capitalist and very much a capitalist regime or system. But the truth is that China went through a very long negotiation to get access to the WTO, and not only declare, but there is very clear evidence, if you are careful enough to analyze the evidence, that China has done no less and probably more than other countries to abide by the rules, right? And what happened? Well, President Trump had, during his campaign, declared beforehand that he will go after China, because China, again, was destroying all these jobs in the US and was not playing by the rules and so on, all the arguments that we hear repeated every day without being questioned by practically nobody. in the media or in the political system. So what happens? I guess the lawyers, the president said, okay, give me an argument. And say, okay, we will start an investigation under the Section 301 of the Trade Law of 1974. That was the legal foundation to start the investigation. Not few months after the start of the negotiation, the report was delivered to the president. What one sees in that report is that there are three reasons why an investigation like that can be started. One is that there is the possibility that there is a violation of trade agreements of which the U.S. is part. They didn't go for that, zero. They didn't say, okay, we'll go and see whether China is violating the WTO, would be the best example. Second, that some rights acquired by the United States under international law are being violated. That was not the argument. And then there is a third reason, which is very diffuse and almost subjective, that there are actions that could affect commerce in a way that is detrimental, something very elaborated but not very clear. So we'll go for that, right? And basically was to investigate whether in joint ventures China was incurring some practices to force the transfer of technology. There were other reasons, but that was the main one. Okay, so you go and read the report. First thing you learn is that since a law that was passed after the accession of China to the WTO, fully owned foreign subsidiaries have no obligation to share any technology with Chinese. This was not the case before the accession to the WTO. So that's not the issue. The issue is about joint ventures, right? And they say in joint ventures, they are forcing the transfer of technology. So I said, I see, but that is not legal, by the way. So I said, so show me the contracts or show me the evidence where that technology is being forced to be transferred. And they say, well, there is no evidence because this is done under the table. So that's really shocking because it says, number one, that U.S. businessmen are stupid, that they are going to go into the deal in which they are going to be stolen technology, and furthermore, that they don't go by the rule of law, which in my experience, that is not the case. They are smart and also go by the rule of law. But here they are being accused of doing deals under the table in their joint ventures to transfer illegally technology to China. Well, that's the accusation, supposedly, but again, with no evidence, and say we have no evidence because this is done under the table. Okay, but the report itself concludes that this should be further investigated, and in any case, should be taken to the WTO. Well, the president receives the report in the morning, and by noon, he declares a trade war on China, based on that Section 301 report of the 1974 law. And I wonder again if the president was explained that they didn't find what they were looking for, so that he should have some restraint, but yet he declares that the first batch of huge tariffs against China's exports, some of China's exports. Not surprisingly, China retaliates, and this is, trade negotiations 101. If they hit you, you have to hit you. It's tit for tat. It's very bad, but it's the way these things work. And of course, the U.S. goes for another group of goods with high tariffs. China goes for that. Finally, it was stopped and some of the tariffs that had been announced for a future date were not applied under the argument that there had been a deal by which China had committed to import so much from the United States. Well, this is quite a paradox because China has been accused of not being a true believer and follower of the market economy, right? In the market economy, well, the buyers and sellers are supposed to go freely to that market, and that determines how much is bought, at what price that amount is bought. And here we have, in the 21st century, trying to govern trade flows by fiat, by command. I mean, this sounds like the Soviet Union, right? And I can see our Chinese friends really laughing, saying, look, the capitalists are imposing us central planning socialism. Of course, that agreement has not been complied with, but the important thing is that China is now the culprit of many problems that happen in the world. Of course, our Chinese friends are not innocent doves. Probably they should be accountable for some violations of rules, but it's also true that we have a system entitled to analyze those violations, and we used to have mechanisms to enforce those rules. And now everybody speaks about China. Unfortunately, all of these policy actions happen to have either some support or some resonance in what some academics purport to opine about international trade, about globalization. And this, in my view, is something that has to be debated, whether it is warranted. I have had, in particular, some argument with the work of another professor in the neighborhood, Danny Roderick, when he published a book, I guess, in 2011, the Journal of Economic Literature asked me to review the book. I read the book, and I wrote my commentary, but I was really, let's say, troubled by the whole story. The whole story was summarized in a now famous trilemma, perhaps inspired in Mundel's trilemma of monetary and exchange rate policy. Professor Roderick said, no, there is a trilemma. The trilemma is between democracy, sovereignty, and globalization. You can have two of those, but not the three at the same time. So I said, really? Let me think about it. I thought about it and concluded that that was simply not true, right? Because basically the conclusion was, if you want to have democracy and sovereignty, then you cannot have globalization. And I happen to believe exactly the opposite, right? Globalization can help you to have economic growth, not only that, but to be in contact with the world, and that will feed your economy, but also your democracy. And when you go to an agreement that allows you to be inserted into globalization, you are doing something within your sovereign capacity. You are not forced to be or not a member of the WTO or other international organizations. You always have the option to withdraw, opt in, opt out, right? So I don't see any contradiction in being a participant in globalization and to be sovereign and to be democratic. And I think I was very troubled because he starts his explanation by giving the example of Argentina, where he says, oh, Argentina hyper-globalized, and look what happened. So the crisis in Argentina supposedly was the consequence of Argentina hyper-globalizing. I said, well, wait a minute. Argentina didn't hyper-globalize. The most aggressive act was to join Mercosur, which is not really the gold standard of an open economy, with all due respect to South American friends. So Argentina didn't hyper-globalize, and it's very clear for economists why the situation in Argentina ended up as it ended up at the beginning of the 21st century, and the reason was simply that having gone into a gold standard, because that's what was Argentina doing to control inflation, and they were very successful on that, they also needed to have a strong fiscal and monetary discipline, which at some point they didn't have. And that is why the whole experiment ended up failing. But blaming globalization for what happened in Argentina is not a good introduction of the trilemma. And I was even more troubled with the recommendations, the policy recommendations that will stem from Professor Roderick's argument. Well, what needs to happen is that countries should have policy space. And if you read the description, it's policy space to do whatever the hell they want to do, right? And actually, trade deals should be about negotiating policy spaces, not about negotiating trade rules. So if I think about the consequence of that, then I get very worried, because it means that, okay, if every country will have the right to do whatever they want, that is called not a rules-based system. That is called law of the jungle, but more formally, the rule of power. And every time rule of power has prevailed, well, we ended up having tragedies like the ones we had in the first half of the 20th century. And of course, it's not in the interest of countries like mine to say, okay, we are going to go into trade, but the powerful guy is going to tell me how to do it, because if I don't do it their way, then they send the boats or the army to impose the rules or that trade upon me, which did happen in the 19th century, by the way. So I worry about that. And of course, the others say, but don't worry, because yes, maybe this will undermine and even destroy trade, but we always have international migration. And it's true, Professor Robert Mundell, when he was a young graduate student at the London School of Economics back in the 1950s, wrote a beautiful brief article using the basic Heckscher-Ohlin-Samuelson model, proving that trade in goods was perfectly equivalent to trade in factors of production. You could have no trade in goods, but you have perfect factor mobility, actually only in one, then at the end, there will be price equalization, both in prices of goods and in prices of factors of production. So I guess Professor Roderick and others who said, don't worry, if there is no trade, there is international migration. Well, really? Please read the newspaper. And I think it's a little bit problematic. So that is to say, getting rid of the WTO or saying, don't worry, we have international migration is no problem. Well, the refinement of this skepticism has continued because now I have discovered that in recent contributions, all this wave of terrible populism that we are enduring and suffering in the world has been caused by globalization, which is a rather interesting proposition, except that when you follow the logic, there is no logic to it. And I will come back to that. And sometimes what is used is the work, for example, of Professor Branko Milanovic. Professor Branko Milanovic has done an incredible work of gathering information on income distribution of countries and then put it together to get a picture of what has happened with income distribution in the world. Some years ago, he published first some articles and then a book with the so-called elephant graph. He basically took, I think, 1988 information, income distribution in the world, percentiles, and then took the information 2008, and then he depicted that and looks like an elephant. And basically what it says is that between the 40th and the 60th percentiles, there has been a significant increase in per capita income in those 20 years. That, of course, the rich, as usual, did very well, you know, the 1, the 5, and the 10%. And then there's a sector around the 80% percentiles where increase in the per capita income in those 20 years was practically nil. And that's why the elephant graph is depicted. And that, I think, is true. There have been some observations about whether that is truly right, but in any case, I take it for granted. So when I saw the title of the book, which associates global income distribution and globalization, I said, well, finally, I'm going to find the evidence that I have been crying for. And I start reading the book, and yes, indeed, several chapters start with the title globalization and this, globalization and that. You know, and finally, I get to a chapter in which the promised explanation is provided. And basically, he speaks about TOP. It says technology, T, openness, O, and P, policy. And I said, well, that's it. Now I'm done. Let me see. And I start reading carefully. And I said, well, you know, what happens is that technology is endogenous to globalization. I said, what? Yes, because countries that have cheap labor, like China or Mexico, are able to produce the hardware that makes possible the incredible IT that has proven to be labor saving. Really, like this machine says, assembled in Mexico. So, you know, and this machine is very useful. I'm being able to talk to you, but also computers and all that, produced with cheap labor. And therefore, technology, which most economists have found that is the cause of most of labor displacement in countries like the United States, is being caused by globalization because the cheap hardware is produced in countries that have lower wages. So that's not really an argument, okay? And then policy is also determined by globalization because globalization is a straitjacket. So here we go. Technology is caused by globalization. So forget about your scientists and Palo Alto and these great creative, great scientists and engineers. It's because the Chinese can produce some hardware in a cheap way, also the Mexicans, and ultimately that causes the displacement. And the poor politicians are subject to the winds of globalization. They cannot do otherwise to avoid what has been a real pain on American and other workers. Obviously, if this is a sophisticated explanation, I should be a professor in physics, of which I know very little, rather than a professor of economics, and therefore I reject totally the argument. I get also concerned when, let's say, partial equilibrium analysis is provided in support of this kind of propositions. There's a very celebrated, for good reason, work by Professor, again, we are in the neighborhood, Author, Hanson, and others, on the China shock. And basically, what they found by studying information in very specific localities, that Chinese exports to the United States caused the loss of something like 2 million jobs over a period of 20 or so years. I don't remember exactly the period. And that may be true. But the question is, okay, and are you taking into account how many jobs have been created in this country because of the significant rise in US exports into world markets, not least into China? And the answer is no, we are just looking at the effect of the China shock, exports to China. Well, no, but China shock is, they also buy, they don't not only sell. Well, other economies, more significantly, Robert Finstra, have done the exercise of what is the demand for labor impact of US exports have risen so significantly over the last 3 or 4 decades. And the conclusion is that about the same number of jobs that have been identified as the China shock have been created in the US. Furthermore, there are other work like by Hofbauer of the Peterson Institute for International Economics, where they find that the US, and I think these are the figures for 2022, I guess, they say the US GDP was in that year 10% higher than it would have been if the United States, as compared with a situation in which the United States would not have been engaged in globalization. And that's, again, more of a general equilibrium analysis. Well, the ambassador just told me, speaking about the tyranny of time, that I should not speak that much. But in any case, what I want to say is that globalization, for better or for worse, some would say for worse, is alive, but it's in high risk. And it's in high risk not because the numbers of the growth has slowed down. I think it's in high risk for a more worrisome reason, because somehow we have been permitting to the abandonment of the rules-based system, not only on trade, but in other important aspects of international cooperation and coordination. And if you don't believe me, well, just think about what has happened with nuclear disarmament and non-proliferation. The system that we thought was very robust, particularly after the fall of the Soviet Union, is cracking and could collapse, as we are reminded by Mr. Putin and by Mr. Medvedev, his marionette every other day, and by others. We continue to have and will continue to have the threat of catastrophic climate change, and as an international community, we seem incapable of coming to an effective and enforceable agreement to mitigate climate change. We had a dramatic, traumatic, painful, very costly experience in 2020 with the pandemic. And out of that, there were a number of proposals to do something for preparing for the next pandemic. And this, by the way, was not unexpected or new. In 2005, I chaired an international commission on global public goods, the provision of global public goods. We decided to identify 5 critical global public goods. And you know what? Number 1 was prevention of pandemics. And what happened? Nothing. Right? And the same again. In 2020, I received a call and said, do you accept to be part of this international panel to investigate the preparedness and the response to the pandemic? And of course, I said yes. But the idea was not only to verify how bad we did, but also to say, okay, we don't want the same to happen again. This is what needs to be done. And please don't ask me what of that blueprint has been complied with. But I'm not claiming that ours was the best, although this was kind of official because we were appointed by mandate of the World Health Assembly. But there were other groups that did the same, but nothing has really happened. So what I see is that right before our eyes, the rules-based system that was judged as necessary to prevent the tragedies that we went through during the first half of the century is simply cracking and being destroyed. And very sadly, the leader of the construction of that good system, quite imperfect, but I would say quite useful, is now a chief actor in that bad task of destroying the system. So I hope that citizens and politicians in this and in other countries reflect about what could happen if we stay on this trend. I would like to see a famous economist in a few years doing what John Maynard Keynes did in 1919 when he wrote The Economic Consequences of the Peace after the Treaties of Versailles, which he was very critical of. And he has this incredible paragraph where he says, there was this great moment in the history, he says, of man, politically totally incorrect today. He could have said, humanity, and says, where a gentleman in London, could have stay in bed and still have order by phone delicacies from all over the world, wonderful tea and all that, could order to make investments by phone in faraway places, or could travel without passport to many places, wonderful places in the world. And so all of that, of course, was the first golden age of globalization, was over in August 1914, the beginning of the First World War. Well, I hope that no famous economist like Lord Keynes will write that about our own age of globalization. Thank you very much.
My name is Victor Peña Cruz. I am from Coyoacán, and I have the honor to see you and to listen to you. You are a cornerstone in Mexico because you did not run for the presidency in Mexico, but you fulfilled a very important space that Donaldo Colosio left. Not only that, but you also faced turbulence in Chiapas with the Zapatistas. And beyond that, you also depict the change in the political system in Mexico from the PRI to change to the PAN. And to hear you about economic globalization, just want to give you a provocative question about Mexico and Mexicans in the United States. You have mentioned that international cooperation is an important feature of globalization. The statistical rumors about Mexicans in the United States are that we are 40 million Mexicans in the United States. And the contribution of money, dollars, to Mexico is very substantial from United States to Mexico through the Mexicans. My provocative question is, would you consider that this 40 million in United States should be considered the 33rd state, at least economically, in Mexico?
Well, I don't really understand that 33 state question. I know that I received a notice last week that I had registered to vote from New Haven, and now they said you cannot vote, along with many thousands, so I think we are far from that. No, but it's true that international migration, significant, has happened from Mexico into the United States. I would say most of the Mexicans in the United States are legal residents of the United States. But according to the figures, there are 10 million Mexicans that are undocumented. And of course, they are here because that means that there is a black market for that kind of labor force. So let me push my observation to the point of saying that, again, it is about policy decisions that cause the existence, or most of the existence, of black markets. It is an irony of the United States that it happens to be an extremely open country for migration, but that manages to build itself a very bad reputation. Because 1 million people come into this country every year legally, but then for reasons of pull and push factors, there is 500,000 that come undocumented. But the question is, why don't you alleviate, if not fix 100% of the problem? Because in this black market, what you have is negative externalities. And the negative externalities that is caused by appearance or for real reasons, by the fact that these people are here, undocumented, that they are exploited, that they have to have menial jobs in many cases, but many of them very important and critical jobs for these economies. All of that could be fixed with a better system of circular migration. Some years ago, the Secretary of Commerce of President George W. Bush, when he had already left office, and I were part of a group with Michael Clemens of the Center of Global Development. And we developed a proposal of circular migration that will address the issues that are of concern in the United States, and of course issues that are of concern in Mexico. So technically it is possible to do it. But of course, the politics of it have become increasingly complicated. So I would say that rather than speaking about the 33 state, well, we should push for an agreement for regulation of labor force mobility. And that, I think, is needed not only in the United States, but perhaps even more urgently will be needed in Europe. Politically, I know today is impossible, but one day politically it will be unavoidable.
Next question here.
Hello, my name is Valeria Galvez. I'm from Guadalajara, Mexico, and I study finance in the Questrom School of Business. First of all, thank you so much for your time, for being here, and for everything you've done for our country. Considering your experience as president, your knowledge of globalization trends, and given the growing interest in nearshoring, how could the different outcomes of the June 2nd elections in Mexico affect the country's position as an attractive destination for foreign investments, especially in relation to its northern neighbor, the United States?
Well, I don't know what is going to happen in the election, but I think I want to make a comment which is more general and in a way more relevant. If you go to Mexico nowadays, you hear politicians and also private sector people speaking with great excitement about nearshoring. That is to say, the relocalization of some businesses from China, mainly, into places like Mexico. And they speak as if these were finally the silver bullet that will help us to address Mexico's development challenges. Well, that is totally wrong. That is totally wrong, and I would say even stupid. First of all, because nearshoring has been taking place into Mexico for many years. For more than a half a century, we have had companies that have been able to locate in Mexico part of their production processes, taking advantage not only of cheaper labor, but other advantages that Mexico represented. And yes, it was helpful, but it was not a silver bullet, as we thought, or they thought back in the past. We have NAFTA, right, which I think has been very positive for Mexico. But it is not true that at the time that it was being negotiated, the idea was that thanks to NAFTA, Mexico was going to solve every development challenge we had. Let me insist, trade is an important but only part of the story of development. Trade can be helpful, but trade is not going to do the other things that you need to do if you want to develop. So the question is, first I sort of dislike the noise about nearshoring because I don't like one of the reasons of nearshoring, which is this crazy trade war against China, right? I think that is totally wrong. I think those guys like President Nixon and others, President Bush, 41, President Clinton, were absolutely right. With China, we need to engage. We have to make China part of the international community. And actually, we can benefit, and we have benefit from the interaction with China. So to be happy because the Americans are fighting with the Chinese, today we trade, and tomorrow who knows how, we shouldn't be happy. We should be very worried, right? But also we should be asking ourselves, what else do we need to do to take advantage, full advantage of this nearshoring, right? And actually, all of that we need to do anyways, independently of nearshoring. So this excitement that I hear from some people in Mexico, frankly, doesn't get my excitement. I think it's a measure of ignorance of history.
We haven't had questions from the back. The gentleman in the back. Please identify yourself.
Hi, my name is Luis. I'm from Mexico City as well. Thank you so much for that chat. I was wondering if you could talk to us a little bit about how current government debt levels worldwide either affect or in which way they affect globalization, given historic record levels that we're seeing right now.
Well, I think the level of indebtedness that some countries have reached, including highly developed countries, should be a cause of concern. But more importantly, should be a cause for having a plan of how to deleverage in the future, to how to make the necessary fiscal adjustment. I wouldn't say that we are on the eve of having a financial catastrophe in the world because of that indebtedness. Although accidents happen, right? You never know when there's a spark and everything else gets on fire. But I think starting to envision the deleveraging that has been aggravated in recent years. First, we have the financial crisis, where there was a need of doing significant counter-cyclical policies, and that was absolutely necessary and was good. Then we had the pandemic, but all of that means that the level of indebtedness are very, very high. So I think the prudent thing to do is to start planning